So my name is Mercedes. I'm joining you from Cambridge, and this is an event that's being hosted by the Jubilee Centre. And the Jubilee Centre is a Christian research organization that seeks to research how the Bible can actually speak into key issues in social, political, and economic life today. And so we're delighted to be partnering with Cambridge Festival to host this event. So central to the Jubilee Centre's work is something called relational thinking, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And it's this idea that everything exists in an intricate matrix of relationships, and that those relationships really matter. And so while we know that relationships matter for personal life and social life, we want to talk today about how do relationships apply and matter to things like public policy, to economics and social relations. And I'm delighted today to be joined by the director of the Jubilee Centre, Jonathan Tame, and Matthew Williams, who is a researcher with the Jubilee Centre and a biblical theologian. So together they will present a short lecture on relational thinking as it has been developed by the Jubilee Centre since its inception in 1983, as well as an analysis of its urgent relevance to public life today and the opportunities that thinking relationally can give us to how we shape the future tomorrow. So before I welcome our first speaker, which will be Matt, I want to draw your attention to the Q&A feature in this webinar. So as we go, if you have questions that you'd like to be part of the discussion, please put them into the Q&A feature, and we'll have a bit of a time to check on those things towards the end of the event. And now I'd like to invite you to join me in welcoming our first speaker, Matt. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mercedes. Yes, hello everyone. It's good to see that we have people from stretching right from the east in Suffolk across to the west in Swansea, and in between as well. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about relational thinking, which it sounds like a very nebulous kind of term. And anything with the word relationships is something which is a bit hard to pin down, maybe fluffy and unsuitable for the kind of hard structural realities of the world in which we live. But what I want to show and hopefully demonstrate to you is it's really an instrument that penetrates just to the heart of some of the most intractable problems we face and has potential to quite literally remake the world. Just to start, let me give you a bit of a story about how I personally came into seeing some of these things as important. So between 2011 and 2015, I lived in Central Africa, and I was working there in tertiary education. And one of the big concerns I had before going there was how to respond to the problem of poverty. So as a child of the 80s in the UK, I'd grown up with images of suffering from places like Ethiopia, especially. And throughout life, I'd seen how big and global a problem this really was. I wanted to make some kind of contribution to it, even as I was there teaching. So over the 4 years I had in Malawi, literally hundreds of interactions with people in really severe poverty, plenty of mistakes along the way on my part, I have to say. One example really stands out in terms of an encounter. And actually, it really kicked off right at the end of my time, where there was a particularly able student from a biblical Hebrew class, of all things, who came to me with this idea he had. He wanted to make his community food secure. And he'd done a bit of training in sustainable agriculture, but he needed some help just with logistics, with finances, and just with really moral support to get this project going. And his plan was really well thought out. I knew he was a real get up and go kind of guy. So we've actually now worked together on this project for well over 5 years. And his community is just transformed. The subsistence farmers who make over 80% of the Malawian population, actually, and nearly all of his own community, they're food secure in a way which surpasses anything in their living memory. And you might think, okay, that's great. It's a triumph for money or technology, or organic farming, or just hard work. But actually, what lies at the heart of this is relationships. And this works at a number of different levels. Firstly, how relationships actually led to this development. Godwin's is a bright guy. Godwin is my area, who is the student. And he's one of the very few in his local area that got education. But he didn't go off and just get a job somewhere in the city and forget about his roots. He remained committed, firstly, to his vocation as a pastor, and his love for his home village and his own people, including his extended family. And he took their rootedness in the land seriously as a permanent thing, as a permanent asset, actually, that they're responsible and that sustains them. And he was a good student, as I taught him. It was a real pleasure to teach. But what that meant was not just that he had success academically, but he developed really good relationships with other staff, including me. And that ended up meaning access to support and finances and networks through me in the UK and then in the Netherlands as well, that could never have been developed otherwise from a starting point in rural Malawi. And the other thing is that development sustainable agriculture techniques in themselves, they weren't going to actually work unless they were taught, unless teams of farmers were put together and committees were established to deal with finance, logistics, etc. None of this would have happened at all if Godwins was unable to deal with relationships. But he could deal with relationships in such a way that enabled these things to be facilitated. And it's not just that relationships were the cause of some of this transformation, but they're actually the consequence too. Because it's not only now that people can eat, but they're actually economically free and independent from these big company factors, which would sell expensive fertilizer, which was environmentally damaging for the land, and actually disable people from having independence in their own communities, just because they were crippled by this debt of repaying fertilizer loans all the time. They're politically more independent because they're not so dependent on handouts as they were before. And educationally, they're much better off because they're able to pay school fees, not only for their own children, but also for those others who live there. Spiritually, they're much more united than they were as a Christian community, because one of the things they do is they worship at the end of the harvest season. It's really a beautiful thing. I've been there when it was happening. The international angle is key too, because I'm part of this working group with Godwins and a Dutch lady, another guy in Malawi. And some of us have got involved in trying to get a fairer tax deal between the UK and the Malawi as a result of having these relationships. So you can see that poverty there, it's not just a case of giving money to individuals to help out in emergencies. And it's not just a case of these big systemic changes at government level. But what I learned from people like Godwins was the importance of what comes in between the local and the sort of big picture. These relationships are part of a network through which the world is made, and therefore through which the world can be remade. And this is what the Jubilee Centre is all about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about now the Jubilee Centre, because it, just as my story, it also started in Africa with Michael Schluter back in the 1970s. And he was also having discussions with students, but instead of teaching biblical Hebrew, he was teaching economics in Nairobi. And the question for these students was a real macro level question. It was, how can we find an alternative to a political economy which doesn't seem to be working out? They pointed to neighboring countries and saw that Marxism in Ethiopia, socialism in Tanzania just wasn't working. But their own capitalism in Kenya also wasn't actually freeing people to have the life that they expected to be able to have with independence. And being Christians, they dug around a lot in the Bible to see what material could be there to help. And Michael was surprised by what he found. What he found was, instead of the organizing principle of society being the state or personal capital, it should be relationships. And this lay at the heart of the Jubilee Centre. And when he came back to Cambridge in 1983 and established it, the aim was to work out how this would actually function across society. And of course, there's a lot of theory which has been developed, and you can go onto the website and find all kinds of materials over the years that have been developed. But a lot of what happened was only developed through practice, through learning by engagement and doing, in a whole range of different advocacy and projects, some of which spawned their own organizations, some of which Jonathan will be talking about a bit later on. But the way of thinking about this that came out of it was relational thinking. Now, you can probably already guess some of its features because of the story I've told you. But there are really three main aspects of it that I want to talk about. There are the roots in ancient Israel. Secondly, the way in which it changed in the dawn of the Common Era, and also how this works out today in practice. So point one, something about the roots of relational thinking in ancient Israel. Comes right back from the blueprint given for Israel. And really what we have here is that there's a society that's built on the foundations of households. And these households are not simply just a small kind of 2.4 families in a house, but they include extended family, often multiple structures, and also non-relatives, including visitors who would be visiting. And they were the real building blocks through which were networked other households and families, which made the clan that formed the local community. These weren't just about emotional support either. And they didn't just keep themselves company or each other company, but they were socially really significant. They included elderly relatives and those without families, visitors, widows, orphans. But economically, this is where the hub of people's support would come from. Each household had land, each clan had land that was allotted to them that would enable them to provide for themselves. And of course, a situation where there's no state welfare, people had to be able to make their own money from the land. Legal issues too were dealt with locally. As much as possible, local courts would deal with things so that the offenders were known and then could be integrated again into the social fabric. It wasn't the case of just everyone who's done something wrong gets put away in some prison and is removed immediately from society. There were central judges for particularly serious cases, but most of the central features really of life were the cultural and the religious ones. The worship life of the country, where people go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year and celebrate. But I say religious, all of life was incorporated in the Torah. So these economic and social and every aspect of family life was really under the Torah. It was all part of what it meant to live by that. So the second point then is, how did this change with the shift from BCE to CE, from the before the Common Era to the Common Era? Because it sounds a bit idealistic and abstract. Well, that's actually true, because things hadn't gone well. The Old Testament is very open about the fact that things hadn't gone well. But the point about the whole Bible, and when you take into account the New Testament, is that humanity doesn't live or die depending on its capacity to attain to this ideal. And the story of Jesus, which marks the beginning of the Common Era, of course, is a story of God's intervention in the world from the outside. But at the same time, it also uncovers what it is that makes this otherwise unattainable and unrealistic vision realistic. And this is a really core aspect of relational thinking, because none of the things that I've described to you are simply a system. They only work because relationships that make them up have real quality. And these relationships, in turn, contribute to the social structure, and the social structure, in turn, conversely, contributes to the relationships. And the quality of relationships that runs through all these things, and which lies at the very heart of the Christian social ethic, is something that you've all heard about, I'm sure, which is love, and particularly this expression, love your neighbor as yourself. But what does that love actually mean in this context? If it's not just a fluffy feeling, what does it mean when it's spread out over society like this? Well, it's really got 3 main aspects that make up for loving relationships. And these are, firstly, mutual knowledge. Do people really know each other? Have they really encountered each other? Do they know each other on that personal basis? Secondly, do they have synergy? Are they aiming for the same things? Do they have similar goals? Are they able to walk alongside each other in the projects of life? And thirdly, is there fairness? Of course, they can't be absolute equality in every relationship between parents and children and between bosses and workers, but is there at least fairness? Is this arrangement benefiting for all? And this is what relational thinking is about, establishing society whose relationships are characterized by these three things in a way that enables healthy structures, which in turn feed back and enable these strong relationships. So on to point 3. How does all this work out today? Well, Jonathan's going to talk about some practical projects and some of the details of how it's being implemented in different spheres. But I want to give some pointers and some principles of how this can actually work today. Because you might think, well, this relationships that make up the blueprint of Israel or there in the Bible, how does that work in the contemporary sort of context? Even this idea of love and mutual knowledge, synergy and fairness can sound a little bit abstract. But actually, if you go back to my story of Malawi, I hope you can see how some of these things actually work out really, really well. Being rooted in household and land, as Godwin's was, living sustainably for the long term within a local community, whilst at the same time having connections and relationships developing internationally and outside the community as he does. And at the same time, for the local community not to be too dependent economically or even politically on the centralized powers of the state. that was something which has really benefited that community so that they can actually be food secure. Because again, of course, there's no central welfare in that context. So these things are all you can see working out in a very practical way in that Malawian situation. But it's not just the case further afield. Because even here in the UK, I think we're particularly aware of this during the period of COVID for over a year now, that local networks are really, really significant. And regional government is actually more important than ever in our nation. It's for the first time in my living memory, certainly. I'm not allowed to go back to where I was born. I'm not allowed to go back to Wales. And you can argue about whether that's right or wrong, but what it's showing that the nations within the UK and the regions within that, again, are having more and more of a say to dictate what actually should be good and right for their populations. And of course, households are increasingly important at the moment as the site of care, and the idea of having household bubbles is even developing this sense of what it means to network households together with a very specific welfare function, of course. And this is important as we get to the stage where the pensions bill is certainly becoming too much for Westminster to foot properly. And when we think about the national situation, I certainly wouldn't want to downplay the importance of the fact that we do have a nation. We have the UK as a nation. And I still remember the impact that the Olympics had on giving a sense of national identity that was built positively on what united us. And that again is part not just of a larger structure, not just an arbitrary set of national characteristics, but a real togetherness and a sense of common history, etc. So these are some of the pragmatic reasons to really commend the relational thinking that Jubilee Centre has developed over these last 30 years and more. But there's also something which is more fundamental in this again. And with this, I'll close. Because people from all disciplines, including sociology, politics, science, are coming to see how interconnectedness is really the key to who we are as humans. We're not just rationalistic individuals. We are at root, we're relational beings. And organizing society in a way that recognizes this really makes perfectly good sense. To take us back to Africa, where we began, there's a saying there that sums all up what I've said. I am because we are. And that's what they call the Ubuntu philosophy. So thanks very much. And of course, if there are questions on this, please feel free to ask them at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for bringing us through a bit of the genesis of relational thinking. And now I'd like to introduce our director, Jonathan Tame, to take us a little bit further and see how some of these ideas have been and can be applied in wider society. So over to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, Mercedes. And thank you so much, Matt, for setting out the theological and cultural foundations really for relational thinking and for weaving in your own experience too. So I want to talk about some ways that this can be applied today, and to really try and answer the question, well, what does relational thinking look like in practice? And I think there's, as I've reflected on this over the last 10 years or so, I'd say there's three main aspects to it. Firstly, it's a lens to see through. We all view the world through different lenses, which reflect our assumptions, our prejudices, our beliefs and values. We may be used to looking at things through a financial lens. So we say, what's the bottom line? By that, everyone knows the bottom line is, the final profit or loss. So that's looking through a financial lens. Or an individual lens. We think about a decision in terms of, well, what's the impact on me? What am I going to gain or lose from this? Or else there's the environmental lens, which we're increasingly asking, well, what is the impact on carbon emissions of this decision? But when we think relationally, though, we try and look at everything through the lens of relationships. So let's have a go. Think for a moment about an issue in the news today, perhaps something, a dilemma or a conflict that's in the papers today. Think about it like this. Who are the actors or the parties involved, directly or indirectly? Who are all the people, if you like, on the stage? And it's important to include the third parties, the ones who may not be directly involved in the conflict, but who will be very much influenced by its outcome. Now think about the relationships between these different actors. Are they cooperative or conflictual? How well do the different parties know or understand each other? How is power wielded in the relationship? And perhaps you're already hearing Matt's three key elements of thinking relationally about mutual knowledge, shared goals, and fairness. And again, ask the question, so who are the third parties? They're not perhaps visible right now, but who is going to be impacted by this? And so this lens helps us to see not just people or groups or issues and arguments, but the relational context in which the whole thing is unfolding. So for example, the tragic murder of Sarah Everard and the public discussion and protests which have followed in the last couple of weeks is really, perhaps you could see it through this lens and see it's really about the relationship perhaps between the police and protesters, or it's about the relationship between a woman who is walking in public and a man who is then harassing her, or else perhaps it's the relationship between that man who's harassing and the bystanders, the onlookers who are perhaps doing nothing. And in fact, it's opened up more widely, and it's been a very fruitful conversation around how men and women relate more generally in public. So this relational lens helps us to see this issue in a much more a richer way. And we need to look at organizations through this relational lens as well. I've never forgotten a comment I heard from a partner in one of the top London law firms saying that companies don't really exist. And I thought, what do you mean? He said, well, while they may own some assets, they are ultimately no more than a network of relationships between the stakeholders involved. And I thought a lot about that, and it's fascinating to acknowledge the reality of that. If all those relationships would come to an end, there would be no more company. And so if this is so, then it just underscores how vital it is to invest in those relationships. So this brings us to the second element or aspect of relational thinking, alongside a lens to look through, and that is it's an agenda for transformation. It can produce an agenda. Relational thinking underscores the fact that relationships are not just a means to an end, but they're also an end in themselves. A lot of social research links well-being to the quality of relationships, and we've seen this especially in lockdown and some of the impact on that. We see it in homes and families, we see it in workplaces, in neighborhoods and cities. And we know that good relationships impact organizational culture and lead to better outcomes. When you have higher levels of trust, engagement, and loyalty within an organization, that will lead to better productivity, more innovation, better customer service. And so this holds true not just for businesses, but for public sector organizations, for hospitals, schools, emergency services. It applies to politics too, and international relations. If then the quality of relationships is crucial to personal well-being as well as to organizational outcomes, then we should be intentional about cultivating and maintaining strong and supportive relationships. So an agenda for transformation will involve seeing if we need to change the goals, the stated purpose of the organization, its values and working practices, in order to prioritize healthy relationships and build social capital. Now note, this is not the same as putting people before profit, as the slogan goes. If that's all we're going on, well, which people do you put first and how? But the relational framework and agenda is much more nuanced and granular, and it offers the potential to improve all stakeholder relationships and lead to flourishing organizations and thriving lives. However, there's still a problem that relationships keep changing, they're intangible, they're subjective. Managers can't make people like each other or legislate for trust, but they can influence the conditions within which relationships are more likely to thrive. It's a bit like preparing the soil in a new garden before planting anything in it. I live on a new housing estate here in St. Neots, and in the first lockdown a year ago, we decided to turn our side garden, which had been it was just clay with a thin layer of, well, don't know if you can really call it soil on top. It was only growing horrible developer shrubs And anyway, we pulled them all up. And when we went and got lots and lots of wonderful compost from a farm up the road and laid it down and spent a lot of time preparing, turning that ground into something in which plants could really thrive. And this year we're seeing the fruit of it. And so in the same way, we can, we can't directly impact relationships between other people. We can only really be responsible for our own, but we can do something about the environment, the context in which other relationships can grow. And so it's important to be able to try and measure the quality of a relationship. And so a third element of relational thinking is to provide something of a diagnostic framework which can be used to measure and improve the kind of drivers for healthy relationships. And this model that's being developed is called relational proximity, and it's based around communication, time, information, power, and purpose. And there's some quite detailed tools that have been developed which can be used in any kind of organization. And it's now being run through a spin-off called Relational Analytics. Okay, that's a bit of a framework for thinking about how to apply relational thinking practically. And so let's look at a couple of examples. And I'm going to start with schools. The relational approach has been developed by our sister organization, Relationships Foundation, and applied in the context of secondary schools in Britain, America, and Australia at least. And what they found is what other researchers have also indicated, is that educational outcomes are inordinately influenced by all the relationships found within a school setting, between pupils and teachers, between parents and school staff, between pupils and other pupils, even between the pupils and their own parents at home. And I'm hoping we can show you a story now, a video of how investing in those relationships can pay huge dividends right across the life of the school.
The Relationships Foundation is a charity that's been in existence for 25 years. It has pioneered the measurement of human relationships across all sorts of public and private sector environments, specifically to measure the quality of relationships between students, teachers and students, home to school, parental engagement, and understand what are the foundations for a thriving, healthy school culture. The more you know about somebody and the different contexts, and the more context you know somebody in, your relationship will be many-stranded. It will be like a rope, robust and intertwined. That's what's happening at Emu Gully here. Staff and students going away, outside that classroom, school environment, and building relationships of vulnerability, experiencing, sharing things they wouldn't see in school, and then taking that back into school. And so those relationships have changed. They're different, they're stronger, and stronger forever.
Mateship is an Australian way of saying relationship. The way we describe it here at Emu Gully, it's a commitment to others regardless of the cost to yourself. And the truth is, the greater the cost you're prepared to pay, the greater the depth of mateship.
Relationships often are built on shared experience. So if you have actually got a whole group of kids who have been through the same experiences together, then now when you're actually in the classroom with them, you can refer back to things and you can help to continue the growth and remind them of those transformations.
Some of the peak activities that we do, they're all built around epic Anzac events. So we have another layer on what we do. We tell an Anzac story because we focus on character, of courage and mateship, sacrifice and perseverance. And then we go and do an activity. So they do the tunnel rats of Vietnam, for example, and they've literally got to help each other through a tunnel system. And the number of times I've seen individuals help each other, hey, I'll go through if you go through. I'm going to be there. I'm scared, but I'm going to help you anyway. And the result that happens out of that is second to none. Going over the bridge is another one. They're up high, and if they get it wrong, they fall in. But when they commit to each other, there's this sense of trust and connection that really transforms the relationship. The other two highlights particularly are the Kokoda track where they go through the mud. Often with the senior group, they actually carry someone through on a stretcher. The other one is the night walk. It's a heightened experience where the consequences are real. And that's why what we do works, because the situation is real. They live it, they feel it, they have to connect with each other.
Their strengths and weaknesses come out very easily in activities, whether or not someone's nervous, someone's scared, someone's confident. During planning times, whether someone's got really good ideas, whether someone goes quiet, doesn't have ideas. So the way that they're kind of forced to interact with each other, actually, in their opinion, have said that it actually helps out within the classroom, whether it's planning in a classroom for projects, different group projects, or even just different challenges like tests or what's going to happen after school, just how they come together and learn to work together.
The Anzac values have been drilled into us over the past few days, and we have a long good think about it. They are like the building blocks of a good relationship.
We've all grown as different people and like grown closer together.
At the start, like on the first day, we were all like only looking out for our friends, whereas like at the end, we were all connected as a group, all talking and all like getting into it with each other.
I can think of multiple times where students have almost buckled under pressure, under the difficulty of the night hikes, and they've been surrounded by their peers who have, up until that point, maybe for 5 or 6 years, rejected them or not liked them or had real relational difficulties with them. And together as a group, they realise that they actually need to work together to overcome what this is. And then a lot of the time at the end of that, sitting out under the stars, reflecting on that experience, students can have amazing times thanking each other and saying things to each other that they've never said before or never been able to say before.
I find that staff to student is probably the deepest bonds that are formed when staff actually interact in the activities and actually face their fears in front of the students, that connection with the students becomes deeper and more meaningful for both.
I think young people really treat relationships almost at a default position of these are the people I'm with in my class, these are the people that I like at the moment. And they don't realise that relationships require sacrifice. That mateship and courage and sacrifice and these Anzac values are actually what are required to have good relationships. These values instilled in our young people help them to be able to go back to school and then to graduate and go into life, understanding how to have successful, flourishing relationships in their future.
Okay, well, that's one example. I hope you could just see a little bit coming from there, just the value of investing intentionally in building up those relationships through that particular sort of outward bound adventure setting. I want to go to another example, which is at a completely different level, and that's right up at the national level. Michael Schluter, who founded Jubilee Centre, he's currently focusing his energies on relational peace building initiatives, a new organization which was started about 3 or 4 years ago. And it works at conflict resolution at the national level. It builds on previous work that Jubilee Centre and our sister organizations have done actually over 30 years now. Currently, Relational Peace Building Initiatives is focusing on the Korean Peninsula, preparing the ground for a high-level confidential process to build trust across the political divide between North and South Korea and work towards a common peaceful future, even the reunification, ultimately, of the two countries. Currently, a stalemate exists whereby America, with UN backing, is insisting that North Korea gets rid of its nuclear weapons as a precondition for ending the international isolation. On the other hand, North Korea insists that sanctions are lifted before it takes any steps towards denuclearization. And despite Kim Jong-un going from being Rocket Man to Trump's best friend after they met face to face a year or so ago, the deep lack of trust continues. It is a relational failure, ultimately. So relational peace building initiatives strategy starts with trying to demonstrate how a relational approach can offer a framework for public policy in the Korean Peninsula, because it provides a bridge between the socialism of North Korea and the capitalism of South Korea, as well as drawing on the shared traditions and values of the Korean people. Secondly, the ground is being prepared for a series of high-level consultations at a neutral venue to explore the feasibility and growth potential of a relational approach across the major sectors of agriculture, industry, and the public sector. And specifically, they are proposing a sequential lifting of sanctions sector by sector, just between North and South Korea, not the wider community to start with, and just to lift to work on one section each year, starting with agriculture to begin with, because there's not least because there's a huge food shortage and potentially a famine building up in North Korea. Now, RPI also proposes an educational and cultural exchange between people in North Korea and South Korea, whereby several thousand citizens from each country would spend a year at a time in the other country studying or training up others, building relationships and establishing the grounds for future cooperation. Now, all this, it depends, for it to start, it depends on getting the initial support of the American administration and the South Korean government, as well as the cooperation of the North Koreans via their ambassador to the UN in Geneva. So the present work involves a lot of high-level diplomacy before the actual peace process can begin. And that's very much what they're working towards. But meanwhile, they're doing a lot of research into the practicalities of this bilateral free trade agreement, which would be the very first step that they would begin with. And they've even worked out how to, they need to create a unique new currency that means that the trade between North and South Korea would be in a new virtual currency that could not be used elsewhere. So trying to kind of bringing financial solutions to this challenge as well. So these are just two examples, but there are other inspiring stories of the remarkable change that relational thinking can lead to. And in fact, I think I've just got time to tell one more story. And this comes from the prison system. Back in the 90s, I think, Relationships Foundation wanted to try and develop the concepts and ideas of relational thinking in the area of criminal justice, which is one of the ones that Matt mentioned earlier. And they worked with the Scottish Prison Service and were invited to try and respond to a case of a prisoner rioting in Greenock prison. And they worked for some time to work out what had really gone wrong, how they could respond to it. And so they began to, one of the initiatives they launched was to set up a shared cafeteria for both warders and inmates. And this is almost unheard of. And initially they sat on separate tables, the warders and the prisoners. But after a few months, they began to share the same table and even talk together over meals. This helped to contribute to a significant decline in aggression and violent incidents. And it's an example of how if you increase the directness of communication and more fairness between inmates and warders, that a more constructive relationship can flourish. Another response to the problem of rioting was to change the relative pay of the warders on the front line who had the most contact with prisoners and the backroom sort of staff in security and IT and admin. Previously, the frontline warders were paid less, but as this was reversed, they recruited people with more relational skills and rewarded them accordingly. And all this helped to calm tensions, especially in the wing which held the lifers of prisoners with the whole life tariff. And lastly, the prison management wanted to improve relationships with the surrounding community in Greenock. And so they invited them to a talent show put on by the prisoners. That included card tricks, magic shows, comedy and musical performances. The impact on the warder-inmate relationship was very positive. And one prison officer said that from then on, he no longer referred to the prisoners by their number, but by their name along with their associated talent. So this is just another example of how investing and thinking relationally about the warders and the prisoners and the wider community can really build good relationships in such ways that the outcomes of that prison, the purpose of that prison, can be more fruitfully achieved and accomplished. So those are my thoughts just in terms of practical examples for now. So let me hand back to Mercedes as we go forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing with us a little bit more about what relational thinking can actually look like in practice, and how that basic anthropology of humans being relational beings can help to inform a sociology where actually we can thrive in much more beautiful ways. And so now I'd like to open this up to a bit more of a conversation between the two of you, looking at some of the questions that our participants have put through. So if I could ask Jonathan and Matt to come back on the screen, and I'll take a look at some of the questions and comments that have come through to open up the conversation. Great.
Yeah, before you start, I want to say this is where perhaps it's really frustrating that, you know, we've got this virtual event. There's 31 of you here. We can't see you. You can see us. I'd love us to be in a room together where we could actually talk face to face and hear each other, listen to each other. So this is a very limited and sort of restricted conversation, unfortunately, due to the nature of the, you know, the Zoom platform, the fact that we can't have this event in person. Our Cambridge Festival events up to now in previous years have all been held in our Jubilee Centre, our lounge in the centre of Cambridge. But anyway, it has at least enabled some of you who are far from Cambridge to join us today. But yeah, we'll do our best.
It is tough not to be able to see each other in person. And we've had some incredible conversations in past events in the lounge. So hopefully in future that can happen. But in the meantime, David, you just mentioned going virtual does open it up to people from different places. So starting with the first question from Joel Evans, to what extent do you think that there's momentum towards relational thinking in the UK? And Jonathan, you've given us some examples so far, but are there any other examples where we see this in practice? So.
I mean, I think, yeah, Joel, thanks. I mean, this is the crucial thing. You know, I've been involved in this for, you know, a good decade now, and constantly this question comes up. You know, people think about it, reflect on it, and recognize, yeah, it is absolutely true that ultimately relationships are the most important things in our lives. They are the source of the greatest value and benefit and well-being and so on, but they also are greatest problems, the cause of our worst kind of, you know, most negative experiences and outcomes too. The problem is, you know, how can this, you know, how can our decision making take into account relationships more and more? And this is always the challenge, because decisions are often made around the allocation of resources. Policies have to be decided on. Scarce resources have to be, you know, the best use made of them, and so on. And so we unfortunately don't. It's much easier to measure things in material terms than and financial terms than in relational terms. And that is, I think, one of the significant reasons why it's so difficult to bring this into management decision makings, even though almost everyone will recognize that, yes, any organization will really benefit from more a greater emphasis on good and right relationships. So it's a case of just chipping away at this, but also of trying to keep talking about a vision for a life and a society where we put our relationships first. We're a very individualistic culture in Britain and in the West generally, and we are used to thinking very much in terms of personal individual benefits or outcomes, and not so much about our shared outcomes, our experiences and our relationships with those around us.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, Matt, I was kind of looking at you. Of course, you can't see me looking at you if you want to chip in anything on that.
Yeah.
No, I don't think anything more specific, actually, no, I think.
Cool. I was going to say, thanks, Jonathan. You've touched on this a little bit already, but how well is relational proximity in the framework? Is this something that is being received well by decision makers? Anything to add to that beyond what you've said?
There have been a number of attempts to really work this through. I know KPMG a few years ago, there was one of the partners in KPMG who really was championing this within their assessments of companies and in the services they were offering to different companies. That was both in the UK and I think KPMG in Australia as well. But that person then left the company and moved on, and there was not the continuation. So it's been there are a smattering of examples where it has been picked up, but often companies, they will be very interested to start with because they can see the potential benefits. But I think there's still a need to try and refine and develop the actual process of evaluating relationships and turning that into sort of specific policy recommendations or management decisions. And what generally comes back is that directors will say, you know, this is really important, we think, but it's not actually urgent. We've got to resolve a whole load of other urgent things first. And so it just keeps getting put on the back burner. But our colleagues, it's not Jubilee Centre directly that I'm responsible for who is involved in this. I'd point you towards our colleagues at the Relationships Foundation and relational analytics, especially, who are trying to take the relational proximity tools and models into different organizations. But the schools project has been the one that's had the most fruit in the last sort of 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. Excellent. And you know, the title of this event, Remaking the World Through Relationship, it suggests in some sense that there is a sharp contrast to the way things happen, the status quo of how the world operates. Relational thinking provides that sharp contrast to the status quo. And so, yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for speaking to that. And we also know that, as you mentioned, relationships it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's not just a walk in the park to think about orienting things around relationships. And in fact, a lack of sensitivity and care in relationships can be the source of the greatest pain or trouble. And so one of our guests, Martin Johnson, has raised a question: how does relational thinking relate to the gay issue within the church? And I'd like to open that up for comment.
I mean, I think that there's an opportunity here for listening and learning. I think so often in the church, people are just much too quick to judge and slow to listen. And I think what has happened is there's been some tremendous progress in that sense of listening, in terms of listening to one another's stories and conversations. And I think that can be quite hard in this day and age, where so often we're not very good at listening. We're good at forming our identity within a certain group or tribe, and we listen and see the world through the perspective of our particular tribe. And the alternative, the other perspective, is something we just have very little direct experience or connection with, and we're just too quick to criticize, to pull down those who have alternative opinions and so on. And that sense of let's come alongside and just listen to each other is really important. And I think the Church of England just brought something out a couple of months ago, beginning of this year, which was trying to listen to those stories of people from the LGBT community and how they were relating to the church, how they felt within churches. And I think this has been a really positive sort of step in that direction, because, as I say, our the way we are doing public debate right now is being so influenced by the tendency for social media to split us into these camps or tribes, as I call them, that we find it harder and harder to have an open and honest conversation with someone who's different from us, whatever that particular issue is.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. That's definitely true. Matt, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I guess from experience, really, I've got a real good friend who works in the medical / NGO sector. He's gay and he's single guy, and he's likely, as far as he's concerned, to be single for indefinitely. And one of the problems, he's just moved home during lockdown. He's changed jobs. And one of the things that we chat about is just how difficult it is generally to sort of break into community, including a church community. And one of the things that makes it much easier is if you've sort of got a wife and 2.4 kids, and that's a very easy way to sort of become part of a church community. And I think one of the things that church can do is go back to some of the things we're talking about with households. Like there's a real place for thinking about households differently in a way which we've tended to limit sometimes, again, to that traditional model that not everyone fits into, including myself at the moment. And I know, again, from experience, like how valuable it is to be incorporated into households, and how much that means. And I think that's one of the main things the church is supposed to be able to do, actually, is to be a network of really open, inclusive, radically inclusive, actually, households, so that people who, for whatever reason, don't fit into that traditional model of what a nuclear family is, are genuinely as part of it as anyone else.
Yeah, awesome. I think, as you've both said, this model of thinking, relational thinking, provides really needed resources, not only to public policy, education, economic choices, social challenges or social areas of question that have historically been kind of laden with misunderstanding. We've got some questions regarding, for example, the Trump administration and America now really being in a state of us versus them, neither one really being willing to consider the sides or the beliefs of the other. And, how can we start a conversation in that kind of a divide and that kind of a climate of polarization? And that also, another question coming from David, similarly themed. How does relationship building in public policy fit in with today's politics, which increasingly appear to revolve around us and them narratives? How and why would the political structures move away from us and them? So I'd like to hear from both of you on this broader question of polarization, us and them, and how actually relational thinking can resource our thinking and our action and our behavior in this situation.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think the experience of lockdown for many people has led to neighborhood and community relationships being strengthened as our immediate physical locality around where we live has become much more important as people have lived and worked from home increasingly. I think that's created just given us an example of what is possible, how it's people have been getting to know their neighbors in new ways, and we're meeting on a different basis, not on the basis of our political views or social views or economic position or whatever, but based purely on the place that we live in. And I think there's a huge contribution that comes theologically around this idea of place and the fact that we share. I mean, I'm looking out of my window here at this housing development with about 1,500 houses, population of 5,000 people or so. And over this last year, I feel I have really got to know this community so much better than I did before when I was commuting an hour to and from work every day. And so there's some opportunities here, which I think this relational thinking kind of gives us some ideas about how we can try and consolidate these opportunities, how we can take things forward. That's just some initial thoughts. What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I guess I'd want to echo that in terms of the importance of relating on lines which aren't kind of already polarized to begin with, and again, I think that's the beauty of certain cultural practices and sport and the things which you can do with people which don't begin on that basis of polarization. I think too, popular narratives are only popular so long as people are willing to subscribe to them. And I think as much as you'd like to be able to transform things at the upper governmental and political level straight away, most people really just can't. And what we have access to now, as Jonathan says, is your local networks, your local relationships. And the question of how to start the conversation across these kind of lines, it's a very practical one. And I really think over a meal, sounds like a very trivial way to put this, but over a meal is probably the best place to start a conversation on some of these things. And it really is the case that, just as the example Jonathan gave about the prisons in Scotland, the people who define themselves in opposition to each other, you start talking over meals and the whole center of gravity of the relationship really does shift. And so it might sound trivial to say, eat together in an age when we have such profound social problems, but I really do think that things begin there, especially for those of us who don't have direct access to the kind of political influence that would change things on the big picture.
Yeah, thank you. I just posted a link to a short video in the chat, which gives a picture of that. It's kind of an apartment building of neighbors who never speak, and that slowly beginning to change just by laying a table in the hallway and everyone coming and finding a place actually over the table to get to know each other. And so I think sometimes the simplest things can be the most transformative. We've also got a comment from Ross pointing to the Colossian Forum as useful in facilitating discussion between highly polarized groups in churches and other organizations. So Ross, if you could put a link to that in the chat, that sounds like a great resource for us to consider. We are coming close to the end of our time, but there are still two more questions which I think are really important. And so I'd like to kind of officially bring the event to a close, but suggest maybe a 5 to 10 minute period of kind of a casual conversation around some of the further questions that are in the chat, for those who are available. And so for those who've got to go at 1:30, which the time now is here in the UK, I want to really thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's been great to see your names, and we hope that next time we can see you in person and continue the conversation. I will put a few links to some of the things that have been mentioned during this event in the chat for you to continue. But in the meantime, I want to thank Jonathan, Director of the Jubilee Centre, and Matt, researcher at the Jubilee Centre, very much for your contributions to the conversation today. So just put that here.
Yes. Thanks, Dorian, who's participated. Do hope to have another opportunity to engage with you. Do come and visit the Jubilee Centre website or the Relationships Foundation website or relationism.net. Those are the ones we've been particularly referring to today. Thanks.
Thank you. And for those who are interested to continue, we've got a few more questions that I'd love to hear from Jonathan and Matt about, because they're really important actually areas in the broader scope of relational thinking. So starting with Anita, relational thinking is missing in all three aspects with respect to our government's perspective on racism. How can we bring truth of lived experience to this? And what is the role of peace building in the UK? So not a small question, but are there any resources of thought, attitude, behavior that relational thinking can provide for us as we think about racism and peace building here in the UK?
Well, I wonder, Mercedes, if you wanted to offer a couple of comments on that, because I know you're very engaged around this whole question of peace building, especially. And if what would you say to that?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it is. I think peace building is one of the most urgent needs that we face in a divided society. And I think I would actually start with something that I've recently been reading by Henry Nouwen, who talks about becoming peacemakers. It begins with an inward journey where you actually learn to make peace with yourself. And to affirm life, that in a world where there's life and there's death, and there's so much destruction and death all around us, the job of a peacemaker is to continually and constantly affirm the small, vulnerable, and fragile examples of life that are before us, whether that's within yourself, within your interpersonal relationships, or in creation as well. I think that that attitude of affirming life and cultivating peace within yourself is really the beginning of peacemaking in the world around us. But in terms of the government's perspective on racism, I know that this is an area of deep brokenness, not only in the UK, but in many nations around the world. And I've been in lots of conversations recently, friends who are coming from all different backgrounds to learn about their experiences. And I think the thing that stuck with me in that is that oftentimes we try to rush towards bringing solutions to these things, without standing from a place of lament to understand the pain and the brokenness that people have experienced and seeking to understand that. I think I can't speak so much to the government's perspective on racism, but I know that for me, that's something that really matters when addressing that. And going through a process of internal change where we actually are complicit in structures of racism ourselves, whether we hold racist views consciously or not, we are actually all complicit in systems that have been founded on inequity and inequality. And so I think relational thinking actually, because it forces us to look at relationships at a micro level and a macro level, it is a good place to begin in terms of understanding where those have been based in inequity. I don't know if that answers your question, Enid, or if you're actually with us. You are still with us right now, but those are my initial thoughts. If maybe Matt or Jonathan, you want to add in.
Yeah, I think what strikes me, to Anita, which is really interesting, and I haven't read the full report, but the report, of course, was released by the government on this, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, is it that, four big recommendations they make: build trust, promote fairness, create agency, and achieve inclusivity. On the face of it, that actually sounds very much like the kind of values of relational thinking that we've been describing here. And I think very often part of the problem in this is it's not always the rhetoric. Sometimes it's actually translating it into reality. But I'd just be interested to know what you thought, Anita, about that idea that actually some of the rhetoric on the face of it is very close to the kind of values of relational thinking that we're trying to set out here, and even showing really that some of the aims that we're setting out really are ones which are commonly held to be important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Matt. Jonathan, would you like to bring anything into that question?
Not really, only that it takes, any kind of reconciliation requires somebody to take the first step. And even if it's not a situation of conflict or tension, even if there are divides that we're aware of, that it takes courage often to step out and risk looking stupid or silly or whatever, to try and listen and to engage with other people that you wouldn't perhaps naturally be in conversation with or in relationship with. And I think and it's also hard to do that without there's pitfalls of appearing patronizing and so on. You can't just go and knock on the door of someone. I mean, I've got 5 adult children, and all of them were home last year. We're down to sort of 4 right now, and I can't just go and knock on my sort of 21-year-old daughter's door and say, tell me what it's like being in your generation, or whatever. You have to try and listen and recognize that there are these differences between where our own outlook and perspective, wherever we are, and the experience, especially the lived experience of others. And I think I keep coming back to this, but a lot of listening is needed, and one of the best ways of doing that is around meals, as I think has already been mentioned. That trying to find opportunities for eating together is hugely important, hugely valuable. And our church that my wife leads, we call it Breakfast Church, and it's a new, fresh expression of church. And we meet in the community centre here, and the people who come are reflective of the makeup of the community. You know, this whole development, about 1/3 of it is social housing, 2/3 private housing, and it's at least that same proportion within our breakfast church. And we sit around round tables together when we're not in lockdown, and we listen and we talk and we share and kind of connect with one another. And I think those are some of the opportunities we need to deliberately invest in, take time to listen and build relationships in those non-threatening ways, whereby we can hear other people's stories and narratives and perspectives more easily.
I think one of the biggest losses of this last year is that that's not been a possibility, and we see the effect of that and the cost of that in so many different areas. Our lack of ability to actually come together. Yeah, and where's the space for listening? Yeah, I would also just add to this question of racism, as well as many other issues where there is brokenness and there is a divide, that it's not easy, and it really begins in our own attitudes, which requires, I think, a deep and oftentimes scathing process of soul searching, so that our words are not empty words, but they're embodied words. And I think that that's something that the Christian narrative as well provides better than any of us can. The story of Jesus, actually, who became a living word and became incarnate and entered into those cracks and those divides. And so that ultimately that's the example that we stumble towards as humans. So one other question I think is actually a really important facet of this conversation that I would be incomplete to skip. It's from an anonymous guest. How do we make sure that the needs of neurodiverse people and introverts are also considered in the way that we, the church and society, consider relationship building? Often it seems that they are having to sacrifice their needs to a much more extroverted neurotypical majority. I think of dozens of times at Christian holiday camps where needing time alone was viewed as a negative thing, to church initiatives to have an open door policy in your home, which is a nightmare if you don't do well with changes. And so that's an excellent point. I think it's really worth speaking to. Matt or Jonathan, you want to dive in?
Yeah, I'd love to say something on this as a fellow introvert. And also, I guess, to respond to the counterpoint that someone's just put up there, I think, Nick, that that actually this situation of not being able to have sort of meals and more of that kind of socializing for completely different reasons has actually been really good. And I know for me, this has been a frustration as well. So I can share the frustration, not just in church circles, but in other circles where kind of activities seem to be geared around a presupposition that you can just keep going all the time, spend all your time with people. But what was interesting, I worked in a college up in Durham when I lived there. And it was really interesting how gradually during the Freshers Week, so Freshers Week is typically the week where you know what happens during Freshers Week. But gradually there was a kind of counter movement from students who were saying, listen, we don't want to go out clubbing. We don't actually like doing that sort of thing. We would love to have more times of like basically quieter stuff. Yeah, not feeling like you got to be with people all the time, but also organizing things where you're enjoying things kind of in the same place, but not necessarily having to communicate. So whether it's like movie night or certain types of board games, which don't require too much interaction. And I think so much of this is actually quite simple, but it just starts from an awareness of the fact that building relationships isn't all done in one sort of simple model. And just like not every Christian is supposed to be an evangelist all the time. That's just not the way it is. The monastic tradition, I think, is really helpful to us here, because some of the most powerful movements in the church have been birthed in a kind of monastic tradition where almost by definition, you're better off being an introvert there. So yeah, I think that's probably what I would say to that.
Thanks, Matt. Jonathan,
Yeah,
would you
I
like
don't
to
really have anything to add to that. I'm trying to respond actually in the chat to Anita, just a comment about, she said, if the starting point is biased, then where is the space for listening? Empty words feel even more othering. I think it is really hard to you know, to find and identify where are the spaces where you know, different sides can both feel at home and comfortable in listening to each other, and even the very context of some of these conversations can really feel you know, a bit weighted one way or the other. And I do think it is really difficult. That's why I'd love to hear from you, Anita, if you've got any thoughts about how to overcome, you know, those limitations. But anyway, problem with the webinar is that we can't hear you. Yeah. But still, feel free to put a bit more comment in the chat if you'd like.
Yeah. I think just in closing, this idea of relational thinking, at first it sounds, you know, it sounds very fancy, it sounds very excellent, and it sounds like, okay, let's do this. And then we realize quickly that actually to implement relational thinking, it's about learning to do relationship well, and that's a lifelong learning process, but one that's so worth it that it invites us to go on that journey of learning how to relate to others well, learning how to relate to ourselves well, how to relate to others, and be challenged. I think that there's no way around it, the fact that it's challenging, but that challenge is worth it. And it's one that requires vulnerability and honesty to overcome some of these divides and humility as well. And so Jonathan and Matt, thank you so much for giving us a bit of a window into relational thinking as it's been developed in and through the Jubilee Centre over the years, some of the applications that you've described, Jonathan, and some of the nuances of what this looks like worked out in public life. I think I want to thank all of our guests as well for sticking with us for these last extra 15 minutes. And Anita, Anita, your contributions in the chat and your questions as well. I think it's a journey that actually we are all on as humans, because we're deeply interconnected in this world, as we see increasingly the challenges that we face are based in deep interconnection, whether that's social, environmental, even ecological, political challenges. They're woven together, and we are too as humans. And so it's a journey worth going on. Thanks to all of our guests for sticking with us, and we'd love to continue to engage with you as you pursue the journey of relational thinking, and to together actually be part of remaking the world through relationship that are rooted in honesty and truth and humility. And so thank you for being with us, and I'll now bring the webinar to a close.